And good evening. It's July 5th, 2024, and welcome to another one of our branches of the vine with the Bible Project and, of course, those Sermon on the Mount series. So my brother and I, we've decided to take a peek at these videos, and then we're going to have a chat about them, right? So on the week that we normally release our videos, we're going to do it with 2 episodes. The first, usually on a Thursday, will cover my comments and thoughts and ideas that Tim and John and those wonderful folks at the Bible Project have put together for us. And then on the day after, usually on a Friday, I'm going to have a discussion with Jim Wern, right? And we're going to bounce around ideas and thoughts and things that impacted us as we saw these. So, welcome this evening to our discussion of episode 6 of the Sermon on the Mount. Don't give, pray, or fast in public on the dusty feet. And of course, before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, that's when you click the subscribe button. Those reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. So this sermon, again, is found in Matthew 5 through 7. And for me, it's the seminal moment in these teachings of Jesus, because this is his longest, deepest, widest teaching that we have recorded in all of Scripture. And it covers things that we for sure, we like to talk about. But deep down inside, I believe we really have challenges living this. Yeah. So the Sermon on the Mount, episode 6. Don't give, pray, or fast in public. Interesting. So, what hit you, bro?
It was interesting watching this one. It seemed like they had, they juxtaposed the real with the, the animated, inner versus outer world.
Yeah.
This one had a lot of inner world in it.
I noticed that too. I agree.
Yeah, almost more than the other, and that's what Jesus is talking about. Mm-hmm. It's like all 3 of the things he was addressing were things that can be very public or very private, and he talks about that. Yeah. But what was interesting is none of them were intrinsically bad at all.
Mm-mm. No.
They're just,
as a matter of fact, the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They actually have divine significance. Mm-hmm. And that's where Jesus says, okay, let's talk about, what that means. Right. It was interesting as I was thinking about the 3 of them. The first one being generosity is more, it's about something toward other people. How am I being generous with other people? Mm-hmm. Prayer is about my activity toward God. Mm-hmm. I don't pray to other things. I pray to the Father. Mm-hmm. And then fasting was more about toward myself, more about devotion is really what it was talking about. And so it's like there's the outward, upward, inward kinds of things.
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot.
All of them, yeah. It was interesting looking at it that way, and then saying, okay, so all of these things have a focus, but Jesus was addressing it saying, you can do all these things and have this inward focus that actually kind of nullifies the whole thing.
Right.
And so I'm anxious to see how we'll kind of unpack each of these with that focus in mind.
Right. So, okay. Good observation. I hadn't seen it that way. I like that. But it seems as if in those 3 elements in that, and I agree with your focus entirely, which is very cool, that he's reviewing it as, even though they are those 3, and I'll bite, and also, like you said, they're all intrinsically good, meaning there's benefit to it. I might even go and say that the first two are referenced in Scripture specifically and for reasons, okay? But we get to the third, was fasting, which isn't. That's not a Torah thing. It's not partial to that. It's not. So there's no, that has become a practice, a tradition, which again, I like, but how this is viewed. Now, all three of them, Jesus is addressing from the public aspect. In other words, what's being seen by somebody else. And he wants us to be aware of that for a couple different reasons. I think one is, like we saw with the animation, where we're seeing the outer and inner, and that inner thought is the more glowing, neon-y, soft, round figures, okay? But our focus is one, that's what's being looked at by God. In other words, when all this is going on, God is looking through the lens of that part. The outside part, not as much as the inside part. And we'll get as to why and all that part as we go. But it's the public part, so now we flip it. It's the outward side that is shown that Jesus is cautionary about. And his metaphors, his analogies can be like some of the stuff that we've already seen before, a bit on the dramatic side, in a sense. So we'll go with, we'll start with, because we're going to get this in pieces, I get it. So let's go with generosity. So we need to be part of that. That's an important part of community. And it's interesting because it's about taking care of your own. Okay. And then we see that in the letters that follow the Gospels, where we see that reference talked about, dealt with often. But he wants it not to be a thing that is public. Okay? Now, like I talk about often on this, is that what things we're so quick to point to them, and they are doing that. And then when it comes to us and turning that mirror around and looking, all of a sudden the tone changes. Our thing changes. So what challenges might you see, because I haven't asked you this question, that you might see in how that generosity, because he's talking about giving. That's what he's talking about here. So how might that be in a way where something that we might do the way we practice today, that is a tradition or a routine that maybe is worthy of review?
Good question. It's funny because I was thinking about, just in general, like my wife loves to give. She gives big tips. She gives big gifts. She gives big tithe. She does everything because she loves it. She's a generous heart. And I could see somebody who, starts out with just that, I just want to give. I want to give. And people begin to see the benefit of that. They're the people who are receiving say thank you, and are appreciative and are grateful. And so all of a sudden your shift goes from I like giving to, oh, I like the appreciation. I enjoy the accolade. And then that's when it turns into, okay, I'm going to give so that I get, the recognition and everything. And so we have to be careful. So apply it, people giving to, a lot of churches have, they call them capital giving campaigns nowadays, to build a building, to start a ministry, whatever. And I remember being a part of one with a couple of churches, and the first thing they do, these companies come in and they coach you on how to look for the big givers and how to woo them into, how to get them to want to give, and you want to schmooze them a little bit. And, all of that stuff that plays into the ego. We're going to name a building after you. We're going to, put bricks in the sidewalk that have your name, and there's the different levels of steps. The higher the steps, the more you've given, kind of thing. And there's that recognition that goes on. And they talked about it. John and Tim talked about it, that giving in and of itself is a good thing, and it's also good to do it in public because you want to show the generosity that God has for you. But it's that wisdom that we need to distinguish between what's going on in my heart. Am I doing this out of just genuine generosity because of the gratitude I have for what God has given me?
Right.
Or am I seeking some kind of recognition as a result of my action?
Yeah, great, perfect. Yeah, and I agree. And I'll take this and we'll segue somewhere in it. So I like where we've gone with this. That point on church capital gain stuff. So you've already introduced the thought of now this is a business thought. Okay. So as soon as you've made that shift, and in a believing community, call it what you will, okay, when that business end gets introduced, I think we've shifted from the God end of it, and so now it becomes a business venture. And I'm for business ventures, but you want to address it as a business venture, whether you talk about it as an investment, whatever. But as soon as you tie God into it, this is now a most important thing because now God's involved in this. And this is what we hear. And then you're right. I've been involved with some of these, capital funding scenarios, mostly with building stuff and those kind of pieces. But they'll even put plates up at the front, and they want people to start the donation. So they write it out, put an envelope, bring it over, and stick it and put it in the plate. And then they'll have a board that's up there that it says like combined federal campaign. Have you ever been involved with that? Same, but the military had that. That was their giving campaign every year. They had this combined federal campaign. And so they would go out and they had a list of places you donated to. And you gave whatever. And it was cool because the plus side was that they listed a lot of places that you could, so you could take a look and see what options were if you were inclined towards either like children's hospitals or animal care or orphanages, or there's lots of different things that they would expose you to that would bring some good stuff up. One of the interesting parts about it, I don't want to go too left field on this, but that they would say what the expenditure amounts were for different groups, because it didn't do it in the beginning, and it became an issue where they said, look, they spend so much, that every dollar that you give, so much goes for overhead, so much goes for da-da-da.
Right.
And so you get the highs and lows, and if you did the research and you cared, that would be one of those pieces. The thing that bothered me was when I got in and found out what Combined Federal Campaign themselves took out of the piece. And I found that out by accident. I said, hey, I have an idea. I'll use Combined Federal Campaign, this was the point, to help us raise our squadron markers on this. So I said, okay, let me work my tithing out through this. And so I would have my Combined Federal Campaign payment that I figured out, whatever that was going to be and what I gave. And the odd thing was Combined Federal Campaign paid them a lump sum instead of the pieces. They went lump sum, which I found out about, which was news, but it was cool. And then I found out how much they got because they told me. And I went, that math is weird, because I know that overhead for them, they're not going to say, well, they get so much overhead. And that's when I found out how much Combined Federal Campaign got, their overhead cost. So everything that you're reading in that booklet says whatever the overhead costs are, that is behind what Combined Federal Campaign does for their overhead costs. Now, I get it's a business. I get that point. It'd be nice to have that up front on the piece. So then it came to one, why was I doing that and giving in those points? And those are one of the, I'll definitely say, not a good choice in making that. For the recognition, whether it was for me or for the squadron, that's not really the purpose or the focus or what we want to do in this particular endeavor. The line that we teeter on, we balance with, and this is a hard one, is that when we give and say we'll donate, and then we'll have a name, like you mentioned, bricks and things and different things that are on their plaques or whatever. And the heart check is, and here's the point, the plaque is up, and I'll be fair and say, for some people, God's going to view it one way. For some people, God's going to view it another way. That's God's call. It's never been our call. But it's not ours to even check. Jesus doesn't even mention that this is ours to look at with somebody else. This is entirely a mirror look scenario. Are you doing? But that balance between naming a wing in a hospital from a donation that you gave or something like that, or a brick, what is my heart in doing that? Can I do that and not? And it's an interesting balance because Jesus's analogy takes us an interesting twist. Because he says one hand doesn't even know what the other one's doing. So that takes recognition almost to say off the table. It's an interesting thought, and it leads people to, but that's not what I mean when I do that. And I go, I'm not sure that everybody that did that then would say that's what I meant, but that's what happened. That's a tough one.
Well, and this isn't the only place that Jesus talks about money, and generosity. And we have the story of the widow's mite, where she gave 2 pennies and the Pharisee gave, I forget what his amount was, but it was way more than that. But when you look at percentages, what was the percentage of her income that she gave versus what was the percentage of his income? And I've seen this with, billionaires who give, $1 million, $2 million towards something, and you think, wow, it's $1 million. And it's like, yeah, it's pennies to them. But it makes them look good because, hey, they're being generous kind of thing. And Jesus is saying it's not about the amount. It's never been about the amount. It's really never been about the money. It's been about the generous intention of what we long to do and what God wants to see exemplified in humanity, because we are created in his image to be those role models of what generosity looks like. Right. And so we need to look at that and go, no, I might not give as much as somebody else. And God isn't asking me to give that same amount. He's asking me to give what I can. And even more so, not here, but in other places of scripture, talking about the sacrifice, that it's given more than I can probably afford, but it gives God the opportunity to provide in ways that we wouldn't necessarily have expected.
Well, now, so you bring up an interesting point. We have, and that's a developed thought. Follow me on this one. I think that's a theological developed thought. And we do this on the thought of self-deprecation in a way. So follow me on this one. So in Scripture, we go back to Torah. We'll use this as an example, is that God says, this is what I expect to give. None of that inspection Torah, none of that in Torah is what we would call sacrificial. In other words, we are going above and beyond and yada, yada. Because there's actually 3 tithes in a strange way. So you have the tithe that you give, and you have those pieces. We have offerings. That's and differences on those little pieces, right? But there's even a tithe you're supposed to give. And basically tithe means to set aside or for a purpose, right? So there's a tithe for that you set aside, and it's like 10%, again, just like the other one. That's for your feast activities, for those 7 Moedim, and particularly Sukkot's one of the ones where it says, look, you need to bring the best of the best because we're supposed to enjoy ourselves during this time frame. So he actually sets up, I joke, we call this God's savings plan, right? His little tithing site to set this aside, because when it gets to that time, you have. And then if you have more than somebody else, there's the point. One of the big things that God does talk about is what he calls first fruit. And that's part of what we have here, is that in that giving, off the top comes this. Not after I've done everything else, then what I have. One would say it's a gross thought, not a net thought. Okay? So it's interesting when we think of it that way, but if we're going on that first fruit, then, and that goes, if people were in that mode, if we were actually doing that, then we wouldn't have a problem. That's just one of those pieces. So then it becomes above and beyond. Now, when we get into offerings and seeing needs, then that goes more. And you're right. That's when it becomes, maybe I can have a little less so that somebody else, and usually it's out of excess, to be honest, that then somebody can give in those points. And do we, and can we do that with no recognition? I would say that probably, to be fair, the majority do. I think this is a minority conversation, but it's the minority that's visible, right? And in this particular call out, interestingly enough, he is calling out and making point the leadership and those that were wealthy in the day that were flaunting it. Okay. To be fair, what you ask yourself is, at what point can I still have that behavior even though I'm not the billionaire? Yeah. I can still exhibit, just because I can still have that billionaire attitude and not have the heart that God is taking a look at here. Again, that graphic, the intersection to everything that God's testing here. Yeah.
Yeah, you've got a whole, I don't know, denomination is the right word, but part of the church that is that health, wealth, and prosperity.
That name it, claim it. Wait, that's one of the terms that we've used. Right. That yes, name it, claim it.
Very much so.
It's taking things that were said out of context. And
exactly.
Right.
That if we're, the theology behind it is that if you're generous with God, he's going to be generous with you. Right. And it's even just saying that out loud, I'm going, wow, because that literally is a works-based. It's, I have to be generous first in order for God to be generous to me. And I think, oh, that's scary territory there. And yet we can still sometimes get into that, again, like you said, get into that mentality, right, even though we don't do it in a large way. Right. But again, what Jesus is getting at is not the action, but the intent.
Right.
And that's, I was thinking too, as you were talking, the inverse side of generosity. I was thinking of the Old Testament model of gleaning, where you're actually leaving a little behind for others.
Yeah.
And you don't know who's going to come in and necessarily, take some of that for themselves, but you're kind of going, I have enough. Let me leave a little extra behind in case somebody needs something. Yeah. And I love that mentality as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you find out that gleaning, which is part of Torah in that scenario, is that my intent from all I've given is that God says, leave those, because there's going to be those around there that are not going to be able to even enjoy the fruit of what's being harvested at that point, that they're there. And then part of it is the practical end, meaning the edges of the fields are against the roads. There's actually a physical thing to that. So that when they wander by, the traveler, the sojourner, and the needy can both get, each of them can get some benefit from that. So just in the fact that we're aware of that overage, right? That it's there. Like I said, it's that you give out of that point, and that's a good visual to that in what we do and how we approach it. And when God can look at that and see that, He can see you can have a farmer in that. Let's use this as an example. That maybe says, I'm just going to leave like 6 inches of edge. It's going to be like this little bitty skinny row because I'm going to meet the requirement, right? Have that. So you're not going to come back to me some, come by and go, oh, look at that. He cut down his whole bill. He didn't clean the edges because they're one of those pieces. Or you have somebody that said, no, that's fine. There's plenty. Matter of fact, I'm going to leave extra along the roadway because they're right there. We know that it happened. We know that people did it because we have Jesus walking with his disciples along and doing that very thing. So we see him benefit from that Torah setup. You mentioned something, and I kind of want to, just for fun, because you opened the door, you cracked it a bit, about God's expectation that we give so that he does. There's an interesting reciprocity in that, and that's fair. God can do it in spite of us or do that, and I get this. Because we even have that introduced in along with the end that's cut off of the Lord's Prayer. We're going to get into that in the next section in the Sermon on the Mount stuff, which will be really fun. But in that, it says, you forgive others so that your Father in heaven will forgive you. So there is a twist of that, of thinking that way a little bit. So it's not as clean as just, it's always God first and us second. That there is at times this flip. So this generosity that Torah, it's nice because I kind of like this thought that Torah says, because I think that's a minimum to me. In other words, that's a base. Okay. So, example, there's a point where it says, hey, if you're chopping wood and your axe head flies off, hits somebody in the head, kills them, what do you do? So it gives all this stuff. So you go, that's great. That's a case study. Like we see with Jesus, he gives an example, right? It's a case study. That doesn't mean it got, hey, if it's not an axe handle accident killed somebody, then that doesn't apply to me. Okay? That I think that we need to think about. That's where the discussion starts. That's the starter, right? So we have here with this, and I love this. This is the starter. This starts that discussion. Then you get into and then, like we're talking about, what does that look like today? Because, yeah, today we have bricks with people's names on them. This is not a ancient thing. This is a today thing. We name wings of hospitals. We name wards in hospitals. We name lots of things. And again, the heart behind it is, am I reflecting the legacy of the life lived before? And I want people to remember that the generosity that was given here was because of the heart and attitude of the person whom I'm naming it after. That's a different heart issue versus somebody saying, yeah, I gave it. I'm, for lack of a better term, I'm going to use this very broad stroke. I'm Jeff Bezos and I'm writing, here's the check, and I want Jeff Bezos on the deal.
Right.
And I'm not knocking Jeff, just merely making this point that's one of those things where you go, this is about me, or is this about, somebody else? So again, the same, like I said, the same plaque on the wall, but God is the one that looks at that heart underneath. Yeah. And then our pressure that we put on people to do this, the passing of the plate, right, in church. that peer pressure of we pass a plate, and then intentionally or not, did the guy next to you put on a plate? Do you just pass it, not put anything in it? Does that even matter? Yeah, and a church may be unintentionally doing it, but that is what's being done in that pass. Yes, you're collecting that. At the same time, there's peer pressure by, do I need to do something so that somebody else doesn't think less of me? And that's not a good thought to put in somebody's head. How many times have we had somebody that's been a visitor to church, and the first thing they know is, first thing they're going to do is ask us for money, take the time and give the tithe and pass out, and they want you to give them money every time as I go in. And I go, yeah, you're right. And they shouldn't, but they do. And mine was always tell them, feel free not to give. And there'll be a time where at passed, and I'll just pass it. You can look at me all day. I don't care. But to that person, that other person that's there, how does that look? And it's because we've set up a tradition, a practice, an institution. Remember those things we say, we don't follow the traditions of men. And you go, yes, we do. All the time. And I think sometimes, just like we're asking here in these passages, and Jesus is referencing traditions that are done, are we willing to look at ourselves the same way? And with generosity, in this particular one, that very challenging part of not letting one hand know what the other's doing. And what does that look like? Right. And it's very much involves, one could argue, no recognition, which makes it interesting.
We've been visiting our kids' church recently, and it just stood out to me. I turned to my daughter and I said, they don't pass the plate. And I said, I haven't even seen where you're supposed to give. And she said, there's this little box. And I saw it on Sunday. It's a little inconspicuous box over on the side and they don't even talk about giving at all. And it's like, that's really, and this is a historically Baptist church, which is usually the plate passing kind of church.
Right.
And what was funny is they do communion every Sunday, which Baptists usually don't do that. They usually do once a month. And it's like, here they do an exercise, a discipline that is about the generosity of God giving to us. But they downplay our response back and let that be something that is stirred by God.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, there's a good example. I like that.
Yeah. In a Jewish synagogue, you'll have the tzedakah box, they call it. It's that same, that's where it's from. Okay. So every once in a while I get that and you realize, oh, what a novel idea. It's been around for a while now.
Exactly.
But it's that same piece where they decide maybe we don't want to have that. In other words, that same reflective thought. It's not like we think what they're all doing that. No, as they say, that's where, and can there be gifts and giving and do that stuff? Yes, we see that. No secret, goes on both sides of the fence, so to speak. I don't like that we have a fence that we're on both sides of, but nonetheless, it's there. But also that point of giving with not pointing it out, realizing that it's still something that your heart needs to talk about. It's not that the pastor on an occasion will mention it in the deal, but what he's mentioning it is to bring that reflection up for a heart to do. And that's why Jesus is doing here. He's bringing this up again for us to reflect upon, because when this comes out later, the reason we're reading about it is to look at it again. We'll wrap this up here, but one of those nice things that the Jewish side of the community does when they do Torah cycle every year. So they go through the entire Torah, the first 5 books, every year, the same cycle, okay? So there's a reminder, and there's events in there that their purpose is to be a reminder. So it's kind of fun when the reminders, how this plays out. But the mindset is that where it constantly gets brought up when it can be forgotten. That's the whole point. That's one of the reasons the feast days are what they are. So that when you wrap around again, it kind of brings that thought, I haven't been thinking about that enough. I haven't, that point where we get the Day of Atonement, where we're really focusing on where we possibly done something wrong to somebody else that we don't really think about every day. But that point where we say, hey, we need to do that kind of thing. So again, with this, when the pastors would bring it up, the preachers would bring this up point is just to remind us. And it's nice. Those Messianic communities, some of them have that same cycle of going through the Gospels in those time frames to do the exact same thing, where we kind of go through and refresh Jesus's teachings here to re-remind us of those things. And one of these points being, like it is in the Sermon on the Mount, not to be read once in your life, but repetitively, is this generosity point. Because I like this, that it challenges our traditional way of giving and doing things and why we do what we do, and then understand that under there, we can say anything we want. But like the animation shows, God will still see. The phrase, they literally have it, the man behind the mask. Yeah, we get into the hypocrite side. So anything else?
To say, having been on staff at multiple churches and other organizations and had a look at the books, who's giving, what's going on in there. Typically, from my experience, what I've seen is the most generous people are the ones you would never expect. They are the quiet givers who just consistently give. You have one-time givers that give a chunk, but that's it. That's all they've given. Yeah. It's the consistent ones who've given little that actually add up to more. Yeah. And it's always been a blessing to me. And I went, oh, I didn't realize, oh my gosh, they've really given a lot. And nobody knows. Nobody knows because they don't care. They just want to be generous because God has been good to them.
There you go. And I think if we thought that way, meaning in both sides of one, not trying to judge somebody else by are they giving,
right,
but understand in our heart that am I, in that side, and what is God going to expect of me? And the surprises, I've said this before about a number of other things, when we get to that end place, whatever it looks like, and the people that are there, I have a feeling, and we'll say the rewards handed out, because he talks about, Jesus addresses this reward in heaven thing. And when the rewards are handed out, I think it's be interesting is who gets what and who's even there. Like you're saying, when you look at that and you go, "Ooh, I didn't expect that." I've said it before, I'll say it again, and I'll continue to say it. That when there's a talk of mansions in heaven kind of deal, and I think Harriet Todd is going to have one of those amazing places. Just, again, the generous heart. Yeah. With the widow's mite, I might add, as a fun thing to do. So thank you for being with us tonight. This was a fun one. We'll continue because this is probably what's going to be with a 3-3-3 deal. So this will work out nice. So folks, thank you for with us tonight with this wonderful episode on our first one of episode 6 of Sermon on the Mount. Again, I encourage you to go back and see it. We do cover it on the Thursday episode, of course, you've seen. That will go and we'll continue to work that direction. So, shalom to you all. Thanks with us tonight on this other episode with my cool brother Jim on the Dusty Feet.